At dawn on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea lay quiet under a pale sky streaked with thin, high clouds. The air was calm, the kind of deceptive morning that made sailors believe the ocean itself was at peace. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, watching a massive formation cut through the waters off northern New Guinea. It was a sight of imposing naval power. 8 destroyers escorting 8 fully loaded transport ships, moving in perfect unison. The convoy carried the 51st Division, 6,900 soldiers promised to Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi at Leh. To Kimura, this was not just another resupply mission. It was the pulse of Japan's empire, a line of lifeblood stretching across the Pacific. For over a year, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled these waters. Convoys moved under the cover of experienced destroyers, anti-aircraft crews trained to perfection, and air cover from the stronghold at Rabaul. There had been close calls, certainly, but no real disasters. The officers on Kimura's bridge had seen American bombers before. They were used to high-altitude B-17s that dropped their payloads from 20,000 feet, falling harmlessly into the sea, or torpedo planes that came in low and slow, easy prey for concentrated fire. Japanese naval doctrine had proven reliable, and experience had taught them confidence. "The Americans are clumsy," one gunnery officer muttered as he scanned the horizon. "They attack from where we expect them to." Kimura nodded in quiet agreement. His convoy moved in a textbook defensive formation, destroyers in a protective ring, transports steady in the middle, each maintaining exact spacing and speed. It was a portrait of discipline, precision, and faith in the Imperial Navy's methods. Below decks, the soldiers of the 51st Division shared that same belief. They were young men from Osaka and Sapporo, many barely 20 years old. Some were singing softly. Others were writing quick notes home. The air smelled of diesel fuel, damp uniforms, and tobacco. In the mess, one soldier laughed as he tried to balance a cup of tea on the swaying table. To them, this voyage was a brief, uncomfortable passage before the real fight on the jungled hills of New Guinea. They trusted their officers, their navy, and their empire. None could imagine that the sea around them would soon become a furnace. At 0600 hours, Admiral Kimura studied the horizon through his binoculars. The sun was climbing, and the ocean glowed gold. The destroyers flanked the transports like loyal wolves guarding the herd. The admiral took pride in that sight: order, discipline, and purpose. He had no reason to think this mission would end differently from the dozens before it. Intelligence had warned of American reconnaissance aircraft in the area, but the reports were vague. Japanese doctrine dismissed such threats as manageable. After all, the Americans had shown little ability to stop supply convoys. The Navy's umbrella of steel had worked again and again. Yet beneath that calm surface, fate was moving. Hundreds of miles to the south, on dusty airstrips in Australia, American and Australian crews were loading bombs and ammunition into modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, machines unlike anything Kimura's men had ever faced. In a few hours, those bombers would rise into the sky, cross the coastline, and bring with them a new kind of warfare, one born not in strategy meetings, but in the minds of field mechanics and desperate innovators. For now, though, the Japanese sailors believed in routine. Anti-aircraft gunners checked their weapons, cleaned lenses, and loaded magazines. Signalmen scanned the skies. Officers reviewed formation charts, confident that their training could handle anything. It was an illusion of control, a brief calm before history changed its rules. The radio on Shirayuki's bridge crackled with reports of light cloud cover, good visibility, and no enemy contacts. Kimura folded his hands behind his back and allowed himself a small smile. His convoy was on schedule. The Imperial Navy had done this many times. What he could not know, what no Japanese officer could possibly imagine, was that innovation and industrial power were about to rewrite the laws of naval warfare.
The American bombers that would soon appear were not ordinary aircraft. They carried no torpedoes, no delicate bomb sights, no hesitation. They had been transformed into flying gunships, weapons of precision and raw mechanical fury. By the time Kimura's lookout spotted them, it would already be too late. The calm of the Bismarck Sea would shatter, and within 15 minutes, the convoy that had seemed so orderly, so invincible, would become a floating graveyard of fire and oil.
While Admiral Kimura's convoy moved confidently through the Bismarck Sea, the true storm was being prepared hundreds of miles to the south, in the choking heat of an Australian workshop. The place was Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, a cluster of tin-roofed hangars, red dust, and the smell of hot oil. It was here, far from any design bureau or factory line, that a restless American officer named Major Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn was about to change the nature of aerial warfare. Gunn was not a conventional man. He had been a Navy pilot before joining the Army Air Forces, a mechanic before he was a commander, and a problem solver before anyone gave him permission to be one. The Pacific War had taught him a brutal truth. High-altitude bombing against ships simply did not work. Bombs missed, torpedoes malfunctioned, and too many pilots died trying to hit moving targets from thousands of feet above the sea. Every convoy that slipped through meant more American soldiers killed on the beaches of New Guinea. Gunn refused to accept that. His answer was radical. If high-altitude bombs could not hit ships, then the bombers themselves would have to become the weapons. He began with the North American B-25 Mitchell, a sturdy twin-engine medium bomber that was never designed for ship attacks. Gunn rolled one into his hangar, stripped the paint off its nose, and ordered his crew to tear out everything inside the bombardier's seat. The Norden bomb sight, the glass panels, the wiring, everything that didn't contribute to firepower. "We're not aiming from 10,000 feet anymore," he said, pacing in the dust, a cigarette hanging from his lip. "We're aiming down the barrel." His mechanics hesitated. They had no blueprints, no manuals, and no authorization from higher command. But Gunn's conviction was contagious. He and his team began welding steel plates into the nose, reinforcing the frame to absorb recoil. Then they mounted two Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. 2 guns became 4. 4 became 6. By the time they were finished, 8 long barrels protruded from the B-25's nose like the fangs of a metallic beast. Each gun required its own ammunition feed and charging mechanism. The team scavenged belts from wrecked aircraft, modified feed chutes, and built boxes that could hold 400 rounds per gun. The wiring had to be rerouted through the cockpit, allowing the pilot to fire all 8 guns with a single trigger. The added weight, over 500 pounds of steel and ammunition, shifted the aircraft's balance forward. Gunn recalculated the trim himself, adjusting counterweights and fuel distribution until the plane flew level again. When he was done, the bomber looked less like a precision instrument and more like an airborne chainsaw. The test flight came at dawn. The modified B-25 taxied out onto the red dirt runway, its engines coughing thick smoke into the air. Gunn climbed into the cockpit wearing grease-stained coveralls instead of a flight suit. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, the crew covered their ears. At 500 feet above the practice range, Gunn leveled out and pressed the trigger. The nose erupted in light and sound, 8 streams of fire converging into a single roar. The vibration shook the entire airframe, the recoil thrumming through the fuselage like a living pulse. Spent shells cascaded from the sides, bouncing off the wings like brass rain. When he landed, the grin on his face said everything. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he said. "She eats ships." Word spread quickly through the 5th Air Force. Pilots who saw the demonstration could not believe what they had witnessed. One observer compared it to a destroyer turned sideways and given wings. Another said simply, "That's not a bomber, it's a buzzsaw." Within weeks, field modification teams across Australia began copying Gunn's design. Reinforcement plates were welded in place,
Ammunition storage expanded, and electrical firing circuits standardized. The Americans had created something completely new, a medium bomber reborn as a gunship. The firepower was staggering. 8 50-caliber machine guns firing together unleashed 6,800 rounds per minute. Each round weighed nearly an ounce and traveled at 2,910 feet per second, fast enough to punch through armor plating. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds ignited on contact, burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A 2-second burst from one of these modified B-25s could shred the superstructure of a destroyer, destroy anti-aircraft guns, and kill exposed crews before they even returned fire. Pilots began to refer to the aircraft by a new nickname, the Strafer.
General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, visited Eagle Farm to witness the new weapon himself. After the demonstration, he reportedly turned to his aide and said, "We'll make 100 of these if we can. They'll tear Japan's lifeline to pieces." Gunn's improvisation received official approval. The newly formed 3rd Attack Group, nicknamed the Grim Reapers, would fly them. Their aluminum skins bore hand-painted names: Ruthless, Dirty Dora, Hell's Angel. Each one carried not just guns, but a new philosophy: get close enough to see the whites of their eyes. As the newly modified B-25 Strafer gunships rolled out of the Australian workshops, a second innovation was taking shape just a few hundred miles away. It didn't involve more guns or new engines, but a daring new way to use the oldest weapon in the airman's arsenal: the bomb. The man behind it was Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group, a quiet, methodical officer who had grown tired of watching high-altitude bombing runs miss every moving ship they aimed at. Benn's idea sounded almost foolish the first time he described it. "What if," he said during a briefing at Port Moresby, "we make the bomb skip?" The idea came from watching children throw flat stones across a river. Ben realized that at just the right height and speed, a bomb could do the same: bounce once or twice on the surface of the water, then slam into the side of a ship at waterline level. It was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. The aircraft would have to fly straight and level, at an altitude no higher than 200 feet, sometimes even lower. At that height, one burst of anti-aircraft fire could tear the bomber apart. The release timing had to be perfect. Half a second too early, and the bomb would skip over the target. Half a second too late, and it would ricochet straight back into the plane. To test his theory, Ben's crews used a wrecked cargo ship stranded on a reef near Port Moresby, the SS Pruth. Day after day, pilots of the 43rd practiced attack runs. They flew so low that their propellers threw white spray off the waves. The first attempts were disastrous. Bombs skipped wildly, exploded too soon, or missed entirely. But gradually, the men learned the rhythm of it: the glide, the release, the lift of the nose just before the explosion. One pilot compared it to throwing a rock so hard the sea itself jumps. Ben recorded every run, adjusting for speed, angle, and altitude. He discovered that 250 feet of altitude, a speed of 220 miles per hour, and a release distance of about 600 yards gave the most reliable results. Fitted with 500-pound demolition bombs armed with 4 or 5-second delay fuses, the weapon would punch through a ship's hull before detonating inside. In January 1943, Ben's commanding officer invited General George Kenney to watch a live demonstration. As the B-25 came in low over the water, Kenney could see its reflection racing just below the fuselage. At precisely 600 yards, the bomb dropped, hit the surface, skipped once, and struck the hulk of the Pruth. A moment later, the wreck exploded in a geyser of flame and seawater. Kenney stared for a long time before turning to Ben. "That," he said, "is how we're going to end Japan's shipping." The 5th Air Force began combining gun strafers with Ben's skip bombers. The plan was elegant and brutal. The strafers would go in first, unleashing 8 50-caliber guns to silence anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, releasing their bombs so close that the explosions would lift ships out of the water. The Japanese defenses, designed to track high-altitude or torpedo attacks, would be useless against this two-stage assault. By late February 1943, intelligence reports confirmed what they had been waiting for. A Japanese convoy, 8 transports and 8 destroyers, was moving toward Lae to reinforce New Guinea. To the Japanese, it was a routine resupply mission. To the Americans and Australians, it was the perfect test of everything they had built in secret: the Strafer gunships and the skip bombing doctrine that defied logic. In the early hours of March 3rd, Ben's crews climbed aboard their B-25s. They strapped themselves in, tightened their harnesses, and waited for the engines to roar. The sun was still below the horizon, and a faint drizzle swept across the field. Someone shouted a prayer. The propellers spun, kicking dust into the air, the smell of fuel mixed with sweat. One by one, the bombers lifted into the darkness, their navigation lights blinking over the jungle canopy. Far to the north, the convoy they were hunting had no idea what was coming. The Japanese officers on watch would soon see tiny black dots on the horizon, skimming the waves like seabirds. The first sign that the laws of warfare were about to change forever. At precisely 10 a.m., the lookouts aboard Admiral Kimura's flagship, Shirayuki, spotted silver flashes high above the horizon. The men shaded their eyes against the morning glare and pointed skyward. A formation of American bombers, B-17s, approached at roughly 7,000 feet. Kimura lowered his binoculars and nodded calmly. This was expected. "Maintain course," Kimura ordered. The air defense officers moved into action, shouting range and bearing coordinates. Every destroyer in the convoy elevated its guns toward the approaching aircraft. The Japanese had practiced this hundreds of times. In minutes, the sky above the convoy filled with black bursts of flak. But as the crews focused upward, no one saw what was coming in low. Barely 15 miles away, skimming just above the ocean, 12 B-25 Mitchells of the 3rd Attack Group and 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters were racing in at wave-top height. Their propellers churned up mist behind them. The sunlight flashed off their aluminum fuselages, each nose bristling with 8 machine guns. Major Edward "Ed" Larner, commanding officer of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, led the first attack. His aircraft bore the name Ruthless, painted in black across the nose. Through his windshield, he could already see the columns of water rising from the B-17 bombs exploding far above. The Japanese gunners were doing exactly what he hoped. They were looking in the wrong direction. At 280 miles per hour, Ruthless roared toward the Japanese destroyer Shirayuki. From the bridge, sailors suddenly noticed something glinting on the horizon. Then someone shouted, "Techie low! Enemy planes low!" The cry rippled across the deck. Gunners scrambled to swing their weapons downward, but the planes were already too close. Larner pressed the trigger. 8 50 caliber guns erupted at once. The entire nose of Ruthless exploded in flame and thunder. To the Japanese crew, it was as if a wall of light had appeared out of nowhere, tearing through steel and flesh alike. The first stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck Shirayuki's bridge at 2,900 feet per second. The windows shattered, spraying glass across the command deck. Metal plates buckled. Men vanished in bursts of sparks and smoke. Within seconds, every gun crew exposed on deck was hit. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata later recalled, "It was like being trapped inside a machine shop." Larner held his trigger for 8 full seconds, firing nearly 900 rounds before releasing 2 500-pound bombs. The bombs skipped once, twice, then struck the destroyer just below the waterline. The explosions blew Shirayuki's midsection apart. Steam and smoke burst upward as the ship began to list to port. Behind Ruthless, 11 more B-25s came in one after another, each selecting a new target. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, flying the aircraft nicknamed the Hare, aimed for the transport Kikusui Maru. His 8 guns walked a line of fire from the bow to the stern, shredding the bridge and silencing every anti-aircraft position before his bombs hit. The ship's captain never had a chance to give orders. The helm was gone, his crew either dead or wounded. The Beaufighters followed close behind, flying even lower, their cannons cutting down any gunners who still tried to return fire. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy described it. You could see the men on deck, their guns flashing. Then our cannons hit, and it was like watching the deck disintegrate. The air over the convoy turned into chaos. Ships wove in desperate maneuvers, throwing up plumes of white foam. The water boiled with tracer fire. Explosions echoed across the sea as bombs skipped across the waves, striking hulls and detonating deep inside. The Taimei Maru took a direct hit near the engine room, flames pouring from her ventilation shafts. The Nojima Maru was struck by 2 bombs that ripped her open like a tin can. On the destroyer Arashio, Commander Koshi Sugino tried to shield the transports by steering between them and the attackers. His courage only made him a better target. 3 B-25s turned their fire on him simultaneously, unleashing a combined storm of 24 machine guns. The Arashio's bridge vanished in an eruption of fire and debris. Moments later, the out-of-control destroyer collided with the transport Nojima Maru. Both ships locked together, burning furiously as ammunition and fuel ignited. For the Japanese sailors who survived the first wave, it was as if the laws of war had been rewritten in front of them. There were no warning sirens, no altitude calls, no evasive maneuvers that worked. The attackers came too fast and too low to track. The sound of the B-25's guns, 8 barrels hammering in unison, was unlike anything they had ever heard. It wasn't the staccato chatter of normal machine guns, but a continuous roar, a mechanical scream that shook the air. Admiral Kimura stood on the deck of his flagship and stared at the destruction. In every direction, ships were burning. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky. The Kenbu Maru had taken 2 hits and was sinking stern first. Men were jumping overboard, their uniforms on fire. The sea, once calm and blue, was now streaked with oil and flame. From above, Larner's gunner watched the scene unfold through the rear turret. "It was like hell had opened on the ocean," he said later. "Everywhere you looked, something was exploding." The entire attack lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last B-25s pulled away, climbing low over the burning wreckage, 4 Japanese destroyers and all 8 transports were either sinking or aflame. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were struggling in the water. One Japanese officer, standing waist-deep in the sea beside his overturned lifeboat, watched a transport explode nearby and whispered, "We never saw them coming." When the last American bombers disappeared over the southern horizon, the Bismarck Sea fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the crackle of burning oil and the distant cries of drowning men. Admiral Masatomi Kimura remained on the bridge of his flagship, staring through a haze of smoke at what had once been his convoy. It had taken only 15 minutes to turn 8 transports and 8 destroyers, Japan's lifeline to New Guinea, into a floating graveyard. The flagship Shirayuki was gone. The destroyer Arashio was dead in the water, locked against the side of the transport Nojima Maru. Both vessels burned from bow to stern. Men leaped into the sea to escape the heat, their uniforms catching fire as they hit the surface. Others clung to floating wreckage, screaming for help that would never come. Kimura gave orders to organize rescue operations, but the surviving destroyers were themselves damaged and on fire. The Asagumo tried to maneuver closer to pick up survivors, but within minutes it was attacked by another wave of B-25s, returning to strafe the wreckage. The low-flying gunships swept the decks clean with gunfire, killing crewmen as they tried to haul their comrades aboard. Even men who had already jumped into the water found no mercy. The Americans, following orders to prevent any reinforcement from reaching Leh, strafed lifeboats and swimmers alike. For the Japanese sailors, there was no direction to run. The air stank of burning fuel and cordite. The sea boiled where oil caught fire. One survivor later described the horror. "The water itself was burning, The heat came up from below, and the sky was red above. There was nowhere left to look that wasn't on fire. In the transport Kikusui Maru, hundreds of soldiers from the 51st Division had been trapped below decks. As the ship sank, they tried to climb toward the hatches, only to find them jammed shut by twisted metal. Others jumped from portholes into the burning sea. In the chaos, discipline and rank dissolved. Men shouted for mothers, for gods, for air. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata later wrote, "I heard men calling to each other, but the voices stopped one by one. A hand reached for me from the water, but when I grasped it, it came away at the wrist. I cannot forget the weight of that hand." By 10:30 a.m., less than half an hour after the first bombs had fallen, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. The burning ships drifted aimlessly, colliding with one another as flames devoured their wooden decks. Explosions erupted at random as munitions and fuel tanks ignited. In the water, sharks had begun to gather. Survivors described the sea erupting around them as fins sliced through the oil, screams cut short as men vanished beneath the waves. For those left floating, it became a choice between burning and drowning. Many chose the latter. By early afternoon, the attack was over, but the suffering continued. The ocean glowed faintly from the fires still burning on the surface, a red and orange reflection that flickered like a dying sun. The sky filled with smoke that drifted for miles, visible even from the airfields at Leh. American pilots circling back to assess the damage could hardly believe what they saw. Major Edward Larner wrote in his logbook, "We didn't need to count ships. You could see them sinking one by one. It looked like the end of the world." By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had left Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would ever see land again. The rest, nearly 5,700 men, were dead or missing. When Japanese submarines arrived after dark to search for survivors, they found a sea of floating corpses and wreckage. The smell of fuel and death hung heavy in the air. The radio reports they sent back to Rabaul were short and staggering. Convoy destroyed, total loss, survivors minimal. Admiral Kimura never recovered from what he saw that day. In his after-action report, he wrote only one line: "The sea itself was our enemy." At dawn the next morning, as smoke still drifted across the water, a few sailors on the damaged destroyer Yukikaze gathered on deck to pray. One of them, a young seaman named Hiroshi Nakata, placed a folded paper crane into the sea. It floated for a moment, then caught fire as it touched an oil slick. He watched it burn until it was gone. When the news reached Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report in his private office. Those present recalled that he read it slowly, without expression, then placed the papers down and said quietly, "If this is true, then we no longer control the sea." The empire he had helped build now faced an enemy that could strike anywhere, at any time, without warning. Until that moment, Japan's surface fleet had relied on speed, discipline, and firepower. Convoys were protected by the umbrella of steel, but the Bismarck Sea shattered that illusion. Within days, the Navy's operational planners convened an emergency meeting. The conclusion was immediate and devastating. Every major convoy route in the South Pacific now lay within reach of B-25 Strafers. Moving supplies by day was suicide. The new order was clear. Surface resupply would henceforth take place only at night. The Japanese called it Yasen Yuso, the night run. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express, but it was a desperate improvisation. The defeat of the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships, it was the death of logistics. Historians have often called the B-25 Strafer the most successful field modification in aviation history. But to those who built and flew them, success was never the word they used. They called it survival. The wrecks of Shirayuki, Nojima Maru, and Kikusui Maru still lie scattered across the seabed, twisted and silent. In 1969, divers from Papua New Guinea discovered one of the wrecks, a transport split cleanly in half, its steel hull pierced by hundreds of neat, circular holes, each one the exact diameter of a .50 caliber bullet. Even after decades underwater, the evidence of what had happened remained. Today, the sea over those wrecks is calm again. Schools of fish drift through rusted corridors where soldiers once stood. Coral grows over the twisted steel. Above, sunlight filters through the water in golden shafts. It is tempting to call the B-25 Strafer a triumph of American ingenuity, and in a sense, it was. But to those who watched entire convoys vanish beneath the sea, the memory carried another lesson, that every leap in invention also deepens the abyss of destruction. Major Pappy Gunn never lived to see the full impact of his creation. He died in 1957 in a plane crash near the Philippines. On his desk at home, they found a note written in his hand. "We built them fast because men were dying faster." For him, and for so many others, the line between necessity and genius had always been thin. Standing today on the shores of Papua New Guinea, one can still look out over the Bismarck Sea and imagine that morning in 1943, the calm, the smoke, the thunder, and the silence that followed. Somewhere below, among the coral and sand, lie the remains of ships and men who witnessed the moment when war itself changed form. The 8 gun barrels that once jutted from the noses of American bombers now rest in museums, their metal dulled by time. But they remain symbols of a truth that transcends nations and victories. In war, the tools that define progress often carry the weight of what they destroy. And as the waves roll gently over the graves of March 3, 1943, the sea keeps its secret, a quiet monument to ingenuity, to devastation, and to the fragile boundary between them.